Welcome back to IMF World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council. I'm Josh Lipsky, Chair of International Economics at the Atlantic Council, and we are pleased to bring you a special event on the U.S.-China trade war, the topic everyone has been talking about for the past month and will be talking about for the months ahead. I could not have two better guests to join me today. Beth Baltzan, the newest Senior Fellow at the Geoeconomics Center, former Senior Advisor at USTR. Beth, welcome. And Brad Setzer, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, also as former Senior Advisor at USTR and Senior Treasury official. So glad to have you both with us in this important IMF World Bank Week. Welcome back to the Atlantic Council.
Thanks for inviting us.
Well, let's dive in. This topic has been picked over, but we're going to find some new routes to dig into. I think most people know the state of play right here. Over 145% tariffs from the U.S. side, 125% on China, lots of exemptions which are worth talking about, and other tools being deployed by China, export controls, critical minerals. So we'll get into all of that. But Beth, I want to start with you. What has surprised you so far, either from the U.S. side or the China side, in this tit-for-tat escalation?
I would say on the U.S. side, it's hard for me to figure out what the priority is, and that's been the most surprising because I think in the first term they were quite clear about their priorities. So if the priority is reindustrializing the United States, I don't understand the freezing of funds from the Invest in America strategy, for example, which was part of the effort to reindustrialize. Is the priority addressing the problems with the PRC acting as a monopolist, the world's factory floor, trying to break those choke points? If that's the case, I don't understand things like removing the security guarantee from the European Union, which puts our entire relationship with the EU in a different place and perhaps less opportunity for cooperating to address the China issues, and then just no understanding of what the plan is. Is it zero for zero tariffs? Where are we going?
Okay, those are a few good surprises. Brad, what surprised you?
I mean, to be honest, I've been a good -1 indicator. Almost everything Trump has done is a little different than I expected. Yeah. I think, to me, the first surprise was that they didn't kind of roll through what I thought was a strategy outlined in the initial executive order on trade, which would have started with the Section 232 sectoral tariffs, would have reinvigorated the Section 301 tariff on China, but would have held off on anything across the board, anything that came to be called reciprocal, until you unveiled sort of your more traditional trade tools. So the sequencing, frankly, surprised me. I was surprised by how quickly the Trump administration escalated on China. I understand going from 25 on a portion of Chinese trade to 25 on all of China's trade. I can understand wanting to go up to, say, 50 on some of China's trade, but going from 50 to 150 without any thought about how that might reverberate inside the U.S. economy, frankly, surprised me. And then finally, I've been surprised that of the various retaliation tools that China has available to it, it actually hasn't really played the currency card. Mm-hmm. And I think there are many reasons why, but I wouldn't have expected that 3 months ago.
Well, let's dive into that because I wanted to talk about China's ability to weather the storm. Currency is a piece of that. How do you assess China's situation? There's a lot of talk that China basically has the fiscal situation, reserves in hand, that they can do more than they've already doing. You mentioned currency, but how much can they do? And there's a lot left to deploy on their end.
So China, one strength China has is that it doesn't actually rely on the U.S. to generate foreign exchange. It exports so much to so many people and runs such a big surplus that even if you zeroed out the surplus with the United States, China's balance of payments position would be just fine. On a flow basis, they would still have a surplus. Now, there's a demand problem inside China, but they are not forced to take action to preserve reserves. They have plenty of reserves. They have plenty of exports. The real debate around China is how can they make up for the loss of demand. Exports to the U.S. are like 3% of China's GDP. A little less if you use the U.S. data. I would use the Chinese data. 3% is a big number. It is not Mexico's 20% of GDP. It is a number that you can make up. And if the current structure of the tariffs remains, so 10% on everyone else and 145 on China, you're not going to actually lose all of your exports. You're going to lose all your exports to the US, but you're going to have ample opportunities to ship parts to other third parties and do assembly elsewhere. So the shock to China becomes, let's say, a 1 to 1.5% of GDP. Big, but that's just kind of taken away the positive impulse from net exports they've been getting in the past few quarters. It is still manageable. A lot of people debate China's fiscal capacity. A lot of people in the IMF debate China's fiscal capacity. I think the key thing to understand with respect to China's fiscal capacity is that China is not actually a monolith. There are many over-indebted local and provincial governments. There are certainly over-indebted property developers. The central government of China, which would be the logical source of any response to the United States, is not over-indebted. Debt is 25%, 30% of China's GDP, just looking at central government debt. And there has been very good work, I think under-observed work, under-promoted work from the IMF that shows that the central government's financial assets, excluding reserves, just their stakes in the big Chinese state companies, is about 25% of GDP. So at the central government level, my view is that China is effectively unconstrained. The only constraint is President Xi's willingness to take action. And so far, he's kind of seems to be playing it a little cool, I would say. Wants to keep supporting manufacturing, keeping supporting the sectors that he values. But if China's growth slows because the big bad United States imposed a shock on China, he's probably willing to allow China's growth to slow and blame it on the United States.
Yeah, there's a political benefit there domestically for a situation that was already experiencing sluggish growth, but now an external issue that he can communicate to the population. Beth, I want to backtrack for a moment on the Biden administration where you served. We got here over a long road. We didn't just show up in the Trump administration and start tariffing. It might feel like that to those who just tuned into tariffs, but this has a history going back to the first Trump administration and then in the Biden administration. And wondering how you thought about the relationship strategically with China and a lot of the tariffs that stayed in place during the Biden administration.
One of the things our old boss, Ambassador Tai, used to always emphasize was how consequential the relationship is, and that you wanted to be thoughtful and careful about how you adjusted that relationship to address challenges. So for us on the tariff piece, we had a multi-year review of those tariffs and adjusted them in line with some of our domestic priorities like the Invest in America agenda. But we also thought much more broadly about the conditions of competition and not just the tariffs. We were sensitive to the range of non-market policies and practices. We were sensitive to the choke points that exist in supply chains. That was one of the lessons from the pandemic, and that you had to figure out a way to address those choke points that wasn't going to be resolved solely by slapping tariffs on. The other piece of it that's important to recognize is we do recognize we have a deindustrialization problem in the United States, and not just the United States. There's deindustrialization in a lot of places, including in the global South, but when you try to fix for the flaws in the trading system that facilitated deindustrialization through unfair terms of competition, you know the consequences are going to hit your farmers. And the one thing farmers told us they don't want is volatility. So we were trying to manage for change without inducing a lot of volatility.
And now we're experiencing a lot of volatility. So let's talk about volatility that we experienced, I guess, almost 2 weeks ago now, the exemption on semiconductors, consumer electronics, and then the 232s. Brad, I'm wondering how you read that decision. There's debate whether strategic, as the administration frames it, or some kind of backtracking based on the inflationary pressures it was creating.
Well, you left out direct lobbying from Tim Cook. And I would put a pretty heavy weight on direct
Option C.
lobbying from Tim Cook. I honestly think it was a little bit of both. You know, as a consequence of rolling out essentially across the board tariffs, while continuing to undertake studies for sectoral tariffs, while continuing, at least in theory, although we haven't heard anything about it, the traditional Section 301 review, there was always an issue about how different tariffs would quote unquote stack. Would they add on top of each other, or would one tariff displace another? And with semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, it was relatively clear that the administration plans to do a 232, and it didn't want the tariffs to stack. It didn't want them to add up. So I think there was a legitimate reason for having a slightly different approach to semiconductors. That said, you could have made that clear when you rolled the initial tariffs out. And that said, obviously the consequences of a 145% tariff on goods where there is no U.S. domestic production and where U.S. companies are relying on China had not been thought through. So there was a non-trivial component of responding to pressure and blatantly walking back a poorly thought through escalation.
So a little bit of all three, and thank you for introducing the important option C, and we will see more of those kinds of lobbying efforts going forward. Beth, we've talked about 232s, but I want to talk for a minute about IEEPA. As the trade lawyer in the room here, let's exactly explain how novel the use that this administration is exercising on IEEPA to introduce tariffs, because I'm not sure people who aren't deep in the weeds of this fully understand, and this will be challenged and is being challenged in court right now.
It's using an emergency economic powers tool that I believe dates back to the Cold War to do essentially universal tariffs. The document that identified the concerns under IEEPA talked about a number of different factors, including deindustrialization. If I were in the administration as a lawyer, I would be concerned that it's a novel use of a statute where the president generally gets a lot of deference, but that either with respect to the use of IEEPA for the blanket tariffs, or with respect to Mexico and Canada, where it was invoked because of fentanyl and the border crisis, the talking points the administration has in the governing documents are different from things they're saying in social media and press conferences. You never want to be the lawyer having to explain why there are divergent bases for what is supposed to be a single emergency. That is where I feel for former colleagues in the administration who will be defending this statute. If there is generally a sense that the executive branch is overstepping its authority, and maybe not just on the trade front, but more generally, you are giving an opening to courts that have been reluctant to step in and curtail that authority. You're giving them an opening to do it.
Yeah. And that's what's going to play out over the coming months. I'll make a plug for our Trump tariff tracker on the Atlantic Council website. My colleague Sophia Bush has created this. We have the legal authorities, we have all the tariffs, we have the commodities, as updated in real time as we can. So Brad, let me turn back to you and let's talk strategy going forward. So now what we hear generally, at least from Secretary Baltzan, is the strategy is to counter China in some way and bring countries on board. One, do you think that is the strategy? And two, how realistic is that to play out given what we've all experienced in the past month?
Look, I think that is the easiest way the administration has to explain what would otherwise be an inexplicable set of decisions. I actually don't think it is the strategy. If that was the strategy, you would not start out with fentanyl tariffs on Canada. Canada actually had matched most of the Biden administration's tariffs on China. Certainly it matched the EV tariffs. You would start off being a little more targeted. You'd start off with demands on, say, Mexico, that Mexico match the auto tariffs and maybe tariff some of the conventional engine cars that are coming into Mexico in meaningful quantities. 1/3 of Mexican demand was met by Chinese supply last year. If your goal was to build a coalition to counter China, the President of the United States would not say that the European Union was basically set up to screw the United States on trade. Nor would you put in place very high reciprocal, quote unquote, tariffs on countries that are on the fence. Countries like Vietnam, countries like Sri Lanka, countries that frankly don't produce anything that has substantial overlap with the industrial structure of the U.S. economy. I think we have to take seriously that the president himself just believes some mix that all trade is bad and that bilateral deficits are bad. And that is an agenda that is in no way limited to China. So if Bessent can pull the president back and refocus this on China, that would be a major accomplishment.
And is it because of what happened in the markets over the past few weeks that you see the recalibration, to put it diplomatically, at least on the communication around the strategy? Is that what has caused this?
I think it's a mix of the market reaction, which has been, I wouldn't say surprising, but for the administration, it has to be sobering. Most administrations are not keen to see the dollar sell off when Treasury yields are rising. You usually expect the dollar to rally on Treasury yields. Most administrations don't want to see something close to a bear market in the stock market. And most administrations don't want to see the major money center banks' chief economists forecasting recessions. So I think there was an element of recalibration. That calibration, in my view, should have been done before Liberation Day, not after Liberation Day. But there was also a recalibration of how you could sustain, I think, domestic support for these actions, given that they are costly, and given that some Republican senators were starting to question whether the costs were worth the gain. China is the one area of greatest consensus.
So if China is the one area of greatest consensus, and Beth, you were in this administration, and the strategy was to counter China, let's just stipulate that that is the strategy, how would you have advised them to go about it, or how would you ask them to do it now, given the situation that they have in front of them?
I'm actually concerned about the effort to, I think you're right, Brad, salvage the strategy by repurposing it as a China strategy. Because now that there are all of these tariffs on a lot of trading partners we otherwise would have been able to work with, without the duress of the tariffs hanging over them, I'm worried that the exercise will be to then just take all those tariffs off and then some, which is why I mentioned 0 for 0 tariffs. If you just do 0 for 0 tariffs and you have not thought through your supply chains and your supply chain choke points, if you fail to do, every time I come to the Atlantic Council, I talk about rules of origin, yes. So thank you, Josh. If you don't think about those rules, you may make yourself worse off. To the extent that tariffs are a tool that help you reshape those supply chains, if you then have a panic and just say, well, we'll just take it all off, you're back where you were in the 90s that contributed to this entire problem.
So if that's the issues they have going forward, Brad, I'll turn to you, and then Beth to you. What happens in, how many days away are we now? 70 days to July 8th? Which I have already been told by the administration is really July 4th, talking to people. So I say 90 days is July 8th, and they say, no, it's July 4th. But that's not as much a counting issue as it is a symbolic issue of when they want the next phase of this to happen. So what do you think is going to happen when we get to this 90-day mark, Brad?
I'll tell you what I think will happen, and then I'll work back. What I think will happen is the administration will find a way to punt the real decisions until September. Because I don't think there will be the basis for major deals. Now, the administration clearly would like to have a set of interim deals that it can announce and then portray the additional 90 days as dotting the I's, crossing the T's. I think in reality, it'll actually, the bulk of the negotiations will take more than this period of time. Why do I say that? Because every account from the counterparts, from the Japanese after they had their initial talks, the Europeans after they had their initial talks, is that they didn't have a clear idea of what the Trump administration wants. And it is just very hard to have a negotiation when you don't know whether you can make, if you do X concession, that will be enough. Nor is there any clarity at this point about whether you can pull off the 10% across the board universal tariff or not, or whether you're just negotiating over the incremental reciprocal quote unquote tariff. Until like the basic demands are clear until it is clear what the administration is ready to give, I don't think there's the basis for substantive deals. So I think then your choices become go back to escalation, run the risk to the economy, or find a way to stretch these negotiations out. So my baseline is that the negotiations will be stretched out.
So if that's the baseline for the world, Beth, what happens with the US and China over the next 90 days? Do we just stay in this situation of 100% plus tariffs on each country for the medium term?
I am not going to take the bait of predicting what this administration will or won't do.
Brad, I'm coming to you next. So fair warning.
I always take that.
But I will say, to the point that was made earlier, that China's being very patient. And part of that, I think, gets back to how we've gone about our relationships with our allies, removing the security guarantee, going after Canada and Canada's sovereignty, going after Mexico. If I were China, I would just watch all of that play out and let those conversations happen and keep quiet. We also know, because the pandemic exposed those choke points in the system, China doesn't have to do huge tariffs. They can find those choke points and squeeze them, and I think we've started seeing them do that. So they have more discrete tools that they can use.
Brad, what do you think?
Look, I think the administration is, my read, without actually having the benefit of knowledge, is that the administration needs to find a way to back off the 145% tariffs. And since
Before July,
that is just causing, trade with China was about 1.5% of GDP, or imports from China, even with the legacy 301 tariffs. 150% to the first approximation on 1.5% of GDP is actually a much bigger tariff than 10% on the 7% of GDP that the US imports from everyone else, excluding Mexico and Canada. It is so high that it seems like companies just can't pay for it. If you pay the tariff and then find you can't sell the product after that markup, you're just stuck. If you're a parts supplier and you've committed to GM to deliver a part, unless GM itself is willing to pay the tariff, you're not willing to, you're just going to say, I'm going to default on the contract, make it GM's problem. So I think we've kind of created a supply chain problem by putting a prohibitive tariff on without thinking through the consequence. So if I were in the administration, I would be trying to find a dignified way to bring this down to a painful but payable level. I also think the president still wants a deal on TikTok. I think the president is more or less seeking a concession on form, on face. He wants Xi to give him a call, which he can then.
Does not want to do.
She doesn't want to do. But at some point, I think they will find a way to talk. And I think while they are talking, maybe preparing for a summit as a gesture of goodwill, there might be a modest rollback created by in essence, paring back a poorly thought through escalation.
So that's something we'll look for over the next 90 days and then past. Of course, we have the G20 summit, but not till November, and no guarantee the president's going to go to South Africa in the current
isn't there a
relationship.
guarantee he's not going to go to South Africa?
I don't think we've heard that explicitly, but I don't know that we're betting on him showing up in South Africa for the G20. Okay, 5 minutes left. 2 questions. One for you, Beth. One for you, Brad. Beth, an Atlantic Council event, we have to talk about Europe contractually,
Yes.
by definition.
Yes.
So how is Europe dealing with this, both in negotiations with the Trump administration, but also the fallout from the high tariff walls? Obviously, China's manufacturing overcapacity is headed somewhere, and
Yes.
Europe's right in the crosshairs.
Yes, it's interesting you say that, Josh, because we were together at an event in Italy where we were warning people that this was going to happen, and we were dismissed as paranoid Yankees who didn't know what they were talking about. And ever since then, I think it's become clear that that tidal wave of product is headed for European shores. I will say the removal of the security guarantee, and none of this conversation is possible without talking about it. Trade people always want to be over here only
No, we're
in the trade
geoeconomics,
lane.
so
That's
we
exactly
like to put that
right. That's
together.
exactly right. That has unleashed something in Germany that maybe none of us thought that we would see the debt break, the expenditures, people taking seriously how to execute the Draghi report and that single market. If Europe is able to create a single market with the kind of demand power that the United States has had, Europe's going to be in a really strong position. And so the question for them will be navigating the short-term consequences of the way this administration has gone about things. Europe has the ability to put themselves in a very strong position going forward.
Yeah, tricky to navigate, but it's there for them.
Yes.
Okay, Brad, final question to you. We're sitting here in the IMF. I was really struck by the managing director's Curtin Razor speech last week. She called out imbalances. She put charts up specifically about China. She talked about long-standing issues over decades that have led to this trade war moment. That is not language you would have heard from the IMF years ago, even a year ago. You've talked about this extensively. I'm wondering how you read that moment and how you read the IMF's role and their responsibility in this situation going forward.
So I very much welcomed the shift in tone. I mean, I think it's fair to say I thought it was a little overdue. I worry it is still a bit incomplete. It was much stronger in the managing director's curtain raiser than in the analytic analysis in chapter 1 of the wheel. But I think the fund does actually have a role. And that role is precisely the role that the managing director identified. The Trump administration believes every problem in the world can be solved with tariffs. I think President Trump once claimed that the problems that Americans have accessing affordable childcare could be solved with tariffs. He genuinely thinks tariffs solve every problem.
I remember that. It was in September.
In September. The reality is tariffs won't solve most of these problems. The tariffs can reduce trade. They generally don't reduce trade imbalances. And the IMF has, the core of the IMF's mandate is actually balance of payments surveillance and finding equilibrium in global trade and global flows. Now, in order to achieve that goal, the IMF has to do more than give a couple of nice speeches. The IMF has long recommended policies in surplus countries, balance of payment surplus countries, that would lead to bigger surpluses. It once has never met a Japanese fiscal deficit that it didn't think should be smaller. Japan has a 5% of GDP current account surplus and an enormously positive net international investment position. And up until very recently, the IMF's recommendations for China have more or less been fiscal consolidation, monetary easing, and let your currency float down. A set of policy recommendations that would lead to a wider Chinese surplus, that would make this China shock bigger, not smaller. The IMF happily doesn't have to change its policy advice for the US very much, because the standard IMF policy advice of fiscal consolidation is in fact the appropriate policy advice for a country with a 6% of GDP fiscal deficit and a 4% of GDP current account deficit. There is another exceptionally technical issue that this raises. And I'm probably the only person in the world who thinks this is important and obsesses about it.
Tell us. Well, with that preamble, we have to hear this.
Now, the Chinese report a actually modest current account surplus, a surplus that is much more modest than that of the EU, much more modest than that of Japan, much more modest than that of Korea. Now, if you actually look at China's goods trade, China's goods surplus is by far the largest in the global economy. And there are a ton of magic asterisks in the Chinese balance of payments data that have turned a $1 trillion goods surplus into a $440 billion current account surplus. The only legitimate, in my view, adjustment is accounting for the tourism deficit. The real surplus is more like 800 billion. And I think the IMF needs to be clear that with the enormous increase in China's goods surplus over the past few years, with Europe's surplus actually shrinking once you take out pharmaceutical tax avoidance, with Japan's goods trade imbalance, the fundamental problem is now in China. And you only reach that conclusion if you look through some of the, I would argue, made up balance of payments data that China is now reporting. So I think it is incumbent on the IMF to be much clearer than they were in the Chapter 1 of the WEO, that China is in fact a problem, that China's current account surplus is not 2 to 3% of GDP, it's 4 to 5 or 6% of GDP, and it is a far bigger problem than the European or the Japanese surplus.
Okay. With that note of work to do for all of us, I don't think you're the only person who cares about it, Brad, but I appreciate you've been on it for a long time and raising it and being specific about it and data-driven, which is what we always try to do here at the Geoeconomics Center. I want to thank you both. I'm going to invite you both back in October at the annual meetings. I hope we found some routes to de-escalation by then, both US, China, and otherwise, but we will assess it at the time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Stay tuned. In 10 minutes, my colleague Ananyu Kumar will host a special event on stablecoins and their regulatory effects and global impacts. We'll have it right here from the IMF in 10 minutes at the Atlantic Council website. And for those here at the IMF, come visit us in HQ2. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of the day.